This is K.M. Weiland, and you're listening to the 474th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I've been working on the outline for Book 3 in my Dreamlander trilogy for many months now, and I'm still working on the first act. That may seem crazy at first until you realize most of my questions, notes, and ideas are actually about stuff that happens in the second and third acts. The beauty of outlining is that it allows you to figure out plot problems and causal linearity before you ever start writing. There will come a moment in my outlining of the first act when suddenly all my work on the latter parts of the book will come into focus, and the events and questions of not just the first act, but the vast majority of the book will suddenly fall into place. When I sit down to figure out the crucial scenes and chapters that will set up my story, I can only make the most resonant decisions if I know what I'm setting up. This is why I spend so much of the early outlining phase working on the second half of the book. If I know where I'm going, I know better how to get there. So that's just something to think about as you outline or edit your own stories. Remember, the end is always in the beginning and vice versa. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast, the second and final part in our series, Learn 5 Types of Character Arc at a Glance. Today's episode is about the 3 negative arcs. Stories are about change. Sometimes that change is positive, driven by hopeful or even heroic people. But sometimes that change is negative, driven by humanity's darkest urges and blindnesses. Both stories are necessary, which is why we're rounding out our 2-part series with a beat-by-beat look at the 3 negative arcs, the disillusionment arc, the fall arc, and the corruption arc. Last week, when we looked at the 2 heroic arcs, the positive change arc and the flat arc, I talked about how someone pointed out I didn't yet have an easily scannable resource that put the basic structures of all the arcs in one place. These series end up being too long to put in precisely one place, but as of today, you can find at least the 5 major arcs all linked from one place. That, of course, will be on my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You'll remember last week's episode also covered the 6 basics common to all types of arc. So you'll want to be sure to check out that episode for the overview of the following: the thematic truth, the lie the character believes, the thing the character wants and the thing the character needs, the ghost, and the normal world. Don't forget that for a more in-depth look at all things character arc, you can check out my book, Creating Character Arcs, and its companion workbook. So let's get down and dirty with the negative change arcs. For starters, we have the disillusionment arc. In this arc, the character believes a lie, overcomes the lie, but the new truth is tragic. To start with, the first act, which will be the first quarter of the story from the 1% mark to the 25% mark, that will begin with the hook in the first chapter, in which the character believes the lie in a comfortable, normal world. The protagonist believes a lie that has so far proven necessary or functional in the existing normal world, which is often a comfortable and complacent place. But then halfway through the first act, around the 12% mark, the inciting event brings the first hint that the lie is untrue. The call to adventure, when the protagonist first encounters the main conflict, also brings the first subtle hint that the lie will no longer serve the protagonist as effectively as it has in the past. And then the first act ends at the 25% mark with the first plot point, which brings the full immersion in the adventure world's stark truth. The protagonist will be faced with a consequential choice in which the comfortable old ways of the lie-ridden first act show themselves ineffective in the face of the main conflict's new stakes. The protagonist will still pass through a door of no return in which he is forced to enter the adventure world of the main conflict into the second act, and this is where he will be confronted by a stark and painful new truth. The second act will span the next 2 quarters of the story, from the 25% mark to the 75% mark. A quarter of the way into the second act, at the 37% mark, we find the first pinch point, where the protagonist will be punished for using the lie. In the normal world, he was able to use the lie to get the thing he wants. But in the adventure world, this is no longer a functional mindset. Throughout the first half of the first act, he will try to use his old lie-based mindsets to reach his goals, and he will be quote-unquote punished by failures until he begins to learn how things really work. Halfway through the story and the second act, at the 50% mark, the midpoint, the second plot point, is where the character is forced to face the truth, but is unwilling to embrace it. The protagonist encounters a moment of truth in which he comes face to face with the thematic truth, often via a simultaneous plot-based revelation about the external conflict. This is the first time the protagonist consciously recognizes the truth and its power. He is, however, horrified by the implications of this dark new truth. Although he can no longer deny the truth, he is unwilling to fully embrace it or to surrender his comparatively wonderful old lie. Then at the 62% mark comes the second pinch point, in which we find the character's growing frustration with his old lie and disillusionment with the new truth. The protagonist is forced to confront consistently increasing examples of the lie's lack of functionality in the real world. He grows more and more frustrated with the lie's limitations, and he begins to accept the horrible truth. He is profoundly disillusioned by his new worldview, even as he begins to be quote-unquote rewarded for using the truth to reach the thing he wants. The third act, which spans the last quarter of the story, begins at the 75% mark with the third plot point, where the character accepts that his comforting lie is now completely non-existent. The protagonist is confronted by an irrefutable low moment in which he can no longer fool himself that the dark truth is not true. He must not only accept this new truth, he must also admit that his comforting old lie is now completely non-existent. Halfway through the third act, the climax begins around the 88% mark, and this is where the character will wield this dark new truth in the final confrontation. He enters the final confrontation with the antagonistic force to decide whether or not he will gain the thing he wants. Directly before or during this section, he consciously and explicitly embraces and wields the dark new truth. Around the 98% mark, the climactic moment is where the character fully acknowledges that truth. The protagonist uses the truth and all it has taught him about himself and the conflict to gain the thing he needs. Depending on the nature of his truth, he may also gain the thing he wants, only to discover that in light of his new knowledge, it's worthless. Or he may realize he needs to sacrifice it for his own greater good. As a result, he definitively ends the conflict between himself and the antagonistic force. And the story ends with the resolution, in which we find the protagonist disillusioned with the new truth. The protagonist either enters a new normal world or returns to the original normal world, but with a jaded eye now that he knows the truth. Our second negative arc is the fall arc. In this story, the character starts out believing the lie, clings to that lie, rejects a new truth, and ends up believing a worse lie. Again, the first act is the first quarter of the story, and it begins in the first chapter with the hook, where the protagonist believes the lie. The protagonist believes a lie that has so far proven necessary or functional in the existing, but often destructive, normal world. Then halfway through the first act, around the 12% mark, the inciting event will bring the first hint that the lie will not save or reward. The call to adventure, when the protagonist first encounters the main conflict, also brings the first subtle hint that the lie will no longer effectively protect or reward the protagonist in her current circumstances. And the first act ends around the 25% mark with the first plot point, where the lie now proves itself completely ineffective and the protagonist makes a move toward the truth. The protagonist will be faced with a consequential choice in which the old ways of the lie-ridden first act show themselves ineffective in the face of the main conflict's new stakes. The protagonist is given an early choice between the old lie and the new truth. She passes through a door of no return in which she makes a move toward the truth, and in so doing is forced to leave the normal world of the first act and enter the adventure world of the main conflict in the second act. In the second act, around the 37% mark, the first pinch point is where the protagonist's half-hearted attempts at the truth prove only half effective. The protagonist tries to wield the truth as a means of gaining the thing she wants, but does so only with limited understanding or enthusiasm. She is stuck in a limbo land where the old lie is no longer a functional mindset, but where her half-hearted attempts at the truth prove likewise only half effective. Then, halfway through the story, at the 50% mark, the midpoint, the second plot point, is where the protagonist glimpses the truth, but rejects the truth and chooses a worse lie. The protagonist encounters a moment of truth in which she comes face to face with the thematic truth, again, often via a simultaneous plot-based revelation about the external conflict. This is the first time the protagonist consciously sees the full power and opportunity of the truth. However, she also sees the full sacrifice demanded if she is to follow the truth. Unwilling to make that sacrifice, she rejects the truth and chooses instead to embrace a lie that is worse than the original. Around the 62% mark, the second pinch point is where the lie proves effective but destructive. Uncaring about the consequences, the protagonist wields her lie well and finds it effective in moving toward the thing she wants. However, the closer she gets to her plot goal, the more destructive the lie becomes both to her and to the world around her. The third act begins around the 75% mark with the third plot point, with a complete failure to gain either the want or the need. The protagonist is confronted by a low moment in which she experiences a complete failure to gain the thing she wants. This failure is a direct result of the collective damage wrought by her lie in the second half of the second act. The means caught up to her before she reached her end. However, even when faced by all the evidence of the lie's destructive power, the protagonist still refuses to repent or turn to the truth. And the climax begins halfway through the third act, around the 88% mark, with a last-ditch attempt to salvage the want. Upon entering the final confrontation with the antagonistic force, the protagonist doubles down on her lie in a last-ditch attempt to salvage the thing she wants. The climactic moment around the 98% mark brings total destruction. Crippled by her lie in both the internal and external conflicts, the protagonist is unable to gain the thing she wants, or gains it only to discover it is useless to her. Instead, she succumbs to total personal destruction. The resolution shows us the aftermath. The protagonist must confront the consequences of her choices. She may finally and futilely accept the inescapable truth, or she may be left to cope blindly with the consequences of her choices. And our third negative change arc is the corruption arc. In this, the character starts out seeing the truth, but rejects the truth and ends by embracing the lie. The first act begins with the hook in the first chapter, in which the protagonist understands the truth. The protagonist lives in a normal world that allows for or even encourages the thematic truth. As a result, the protagonist starts out with an understanding of the truth. Then halfway through the first act, around the 12% mark, the inciting event brings the first temptation of the lie. The call to adventure, when the protagonist first encounters the main conflict, also brings that first subtle temptation that the lie might be able to serve the protagonist better than the truth. The first act ends around the 25% mark with the first plot point in which the protagonist enters the beguiling adventure world of the lie. The protagonist is faced with a consequential choice, in which he is enticed out of the first act's safe, truth-based, normal world into the second act's beguiling, lie-based adventure world. Not realizing the danger, or believing he is weighing the consequences, the protagonist is lured through the door of no return by the promise of the thing he wants. In the second act, at the 37% mark, the first pinch point shows the protagonist torn between the truth and the lie. The protagonist is torn between his old truth and his new lie. The lie proves itself effective in moving him nearer and nearer the thing he wants. But he wages an internal conflict as he recognizes he is moving further and further away from his old convictions and understandings of the world. Halfway through the book, the midpoint or second plot point is where the character embraces the lie, but without yet fully rejecting the truth. The protagonist encounters a moment of truth in which he comes face to face with the lie in all its power. He recognizes he cannot gain the thing he wants without the lie. Although he is not yet willing to fully and consciously reject the truth, he makes the decision to fully embrace the lie. At the 62% mark, the second pinch point shows the protagonist resisting the sacrifice that is demanded by the truth. The protagonist is quote-unquote rewarded for using the lie. Building upon what he learned at the midpoint, the protagonist will start implementing lie-based actions in combating the antagonistic force and reaching toward the thing he wants. The truth pulls on him, demanding sacrifices he is not willing to give. He begins resisting the truth more and more adamantly. The third act begins with the third plot point around the 75% mark, in which the protagonist fully embraces the lie. The protagonist utterly rejects the truth and embraces the lie. He acts upon this in a way that creates a low moment for the world around him, and for him morally, even if he refuses to recognize it. He is now willing to knowingly endure the consequences of rejecting the truth in exchange for what he sees as the rewards of embracing the lie. Halfway through the third act, the climax, around the 88% mark, is where we see the protagonist in a final push to gain the thing he wants. The protagonist enters the final confrontation with the antagonistic force to decide whether or not he will gain the thing he wants. Unhampered by the truth, he pushes forward ruthlessly toward his plot goal, which brings him to the climactic moment around the 98% mark, in which we find moral failure. The protagonist uses the lie and all it has taught him in an attempt to gain the thing he wants. He may gain the thing he wants and remain senseless to the evil engendered by his actions. Or he may gain the thing he wants only to be devastated when he realizes it wasn't worth what he sacrificed. Or he may fail to gain the thing he wants and be devastated by the realization that his sacrifices to the lie were fruitless. One way or another, he definitively ends the conflict between himself and the antagonistic force. And that leads directly into the resolution and the aftermath. The protagonist must confront the aftermath of his choices. He may turn away from the lie, admitting his mistake and accepting the consequences, or he may callously forge ahead, intent on continuing to use the lie to further his own ends. Needless to say, there are many variations of these 5 arcs, but if you can identify and master these 5, you're well on your way to writing a powerful evolution that will resonate with all your readers. So tell me your opinions. Again, what type of character arcs have you written? If you'd like to be a part of the Word Player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast. And if you'd like to support Helping Writers Become Authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave a quick rating or review on the Apple site. Thanks so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.